Afternoon and welcome wherever you're joining me across the country today. I'm Dan Bourchier and it's my great pleasure to be your facilitator, guiding you through this discussion on this very important day, Close the Gap Day, where we're going to be hearing more about this report that's being launched today online and across the nation, Leadership and Legacy Through Crisis, Keeping Our Mob Safe, the Close the Gap campaign report for 2021. And at this point in beginning, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Ngunnawal people, and in particular for their custodianship of this country, the story, the songlines, but also the way that the elders have shared that with me and right across our community. I'm very grateful for that because my own heritage is such a different story without all of that connection as a result of the policies in Australia in recent decades. I also want to acknowledge all of the Indigenous people here today on the incredible panel, the committee, the co-chairs who are here as well, the leadership who have written this report. There are some of the most incredible First Nations people who are part of this today, including you, wherever you're watching. And I want to pay respect to your elders, those that have been sharing that knowledge, maintaining culture, connection, the stories, those things that bring us together and give us a sense of who we are and how we interact to each other. We have got a bit to get through today. Firstly, you're going to be hearing from the Close the Gap campaign co-chairs, June Oscar AO, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner. Karl Briscoe is the CEO of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Workers Association. They're the co-chairs that have been sitting at the apex of this enormous group of committed First Nations people across the nation. So you're going to hear from both of them. The Minister for Indigenous Australians, Ken Wyatt AM, is also going to be here shortly. You'll also hear from globally renowned health expert Sir Michael Marmot. Lowitja Institute CEO Janine Mohamed is going to explain about the report and give us a sense of leadership and legacy through crisis, how to keep our mob safe. We've got a panel as well of some incredible First Nations people, and you'll hear from the Australia Institute. We're very grateful that they've been partnering with this campaign, hosting the webinar today and doing lots of work around closing the gap and facilitating these big conversations about what it means to be an Australian. But without any further ado, June Oscar AO is a Bunurba woman from Fitzroy Crossing in Western Australia, a passionate advocate for First Nations people, particularly children. And she's been the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner since 2017. But she's more than that, and it's such a powerful voice for Indigenous people right across the nation. And I've known June for some time. I first met her when I was a cub reporter working at National Indigenous Television, and she was advocating for children in Fitzroy Crossing and getting that story out to the nation, to have a big conversation about what was happening there and to some of our children. It's so great to have you along, June. Over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Wow. Good morning, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Bunurba country today. Winji dalulami ngirango maninga, waramba girgara ngirango, bugayane watpuraga mea kawi warama wuraga, moai ngirango melurani. It has been pouring rain up here. The flood waters are high. Our children are out hunting and fishing. Our country is alive. I hope your country is alive and well too, wherever you are. So again, thank you, Dan. And thank you to the Australia Institute for supporting this event. Welcome to all our guests and speakers across Australia and beyond our lands, including the 54 members of the Close the Gap campaign. Thank you, a huge thank you to Dr. Janine Mohamed and the Lowitja Institute for writing this report. And I acknowledge my co-chair, Mr. Karl Briscoe. You are amazing. And thank you to the Minister, Mr. Ken Wyatt, for joining us on this very important occasion. It is my privilege to welcome you from Bunuba country in the Kimberley in Western Australia. We have all been able to carry out our work and remain focused in this time of crisis in the safest places. Once again, it has proven how important our traditional countries and our communities are to our health and well-being. This is another important day to report on the unfinished business of achieving health, justice, education, and employment equality for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We remain tireless in our advocacy and in our determination. We know how to survive and we know how to thrive. It's proven by our track record of being the oldest living civilization on Earth. We clearly have always known what it is to belong to safe, inclusive, equitable, and healthy societies. That is why we must use our knowledges and learnings to confront and overcome the current deficits we face today. We know that we can increase our life expectancy, that we can reduce incarceration rates and end deaths in custody, that we can have positive physical and mental health. This is what we deserve in Australia. Today, we can all act on the solutions we have to reverse the statistics of deficit. None of us need reminding of the challenges of the past 12 months. Challenges requires leadership and solutions. And this report is overflowing with both. The loss of our sacred native species through devastating bushfires and the exposure of inequalities due to the pandemic has helped so many more come to the realization that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have the solutions and the capacity for all of society to keep families and communities safe before, during, and after a crisis. It is time that our identity, our sacred places, our countries, our health, and our well-being are protected from those who threaten all of this for short-term gain. Today, through our speakers and the report, we again proudly showcase our strengths, our culture, our leadership in community, and the legacies we will leave our children. We show the pathways forward, how to protect country from climate change, to prevent suicide through nurturing social and emotional well-being, and how to protect communities against a global pandemic. The new national agreement on closing the gap, signed mid last year, was long overdue, yet welcomed. Finally, governments met genuinely with Indigenous leaders, with our leaders, the coalition of peaks, and negotiated as equal partners. This provides a real opportunity for reform and progress. Australia, as we know, is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Indigenous people make up almost 3.5% of the population. We all know that it is absolutely possible to achieve positive generational health and equality for our population of 1 million First Nations people. To do this, we require robust implementation frameworks that have mechanisms to guarantee progress to close gaps wherever they are. We need this from not just the Commonwealth, but from all states and territories. We urge all governments to work with us as co-decision makers and designers, and to genuinely commit to implementation plans and investment that meets the needs. For us to do this, for meaningful engagement to happen, we have to address our right to a voice, to our self-determination. We have called for government's attention to our right to our Black lives to matter. We have called for governments to engage in treaty, truth-telling, and healing. These processes are before us. We can all see that. For us as a nation to become reconciled and to strengthen our voice in the fabric of this nation, so together we can heal and strengthen our commonwealth. To reach these outcomes takes partnerships. Governments cannot deliver this on their own, but together as trusted collaborators, we can do this. And that is the promise of Close the Gap. Thank you for your support. Thank you for listening, and please enjoy the report launch today. Janine, thank you.
June, thank you so much for such a powerful speech and for capturing the so very many challenges there, but as you point out, so many opportunities and solutions that are right in this report. It has got so many ideas of where to from here. And I just want to pick up on a couple of things that you said that particularly jumped out at me, particularly working in the media around reversing the statistics of deficit. That is so important for all of us as a nation, to not be seen as statistics, but have the rightful place that we deserve. The challenges require the leadership solutions that you pointed out are in the report. I couldn't agree more, having read it. And that call, that clarion call to political and policy makers to work with us to co-design and make those decisions. And I think that has to be getting heard right across the board. So thank you so much for that speech, for your leadership, along with Karl and the whole team, but also for your role in advocating for First Nations people and everything you do, particularly at that commissioner level. So I know I'm very grateful. I'm sure many people are here and right around the nation today. So thank you so much. Our next guest is the Honourable Ken Wyatt AM, an Aboriginal man with Noongar, Yamatji and Wongai heritage. He's the first Indigenous Australian elected to the House of Representatives, the first Indigenous person to serve as a federal minister, and the first Aboriginal person to sit in cabinet. He is now Minister for Indigenous Australians, and he's with us now. Yuma, welcome.
Now you can hear?
Certainly can.
Kaya Wanju. Hello and welcome in my Noongar language. Today I'm dialing in from Ngunnawal country, and I'm grateful to be welcomed to this country and pay my respects to elders past and present and the young ones who are emerging. I'd like to acknowledge all country where you're calling from today, and pay my respects to you. I want to associate myself also with many of the comments that June made, because that is the direction that we're heading in terms of co-design by Commonwealth agencies. It's a significant shift from the practice of the past. They're finding it challenging, but equally, they're rising to grab an opportunity to work much more closely with our people across this country. And thank you for the opportunity to speak, particularly on such an important occasion as the National Close the Gap Day. I want to thank the Close the Gap Steering Committee for their continued passion and dedication over many years towards a future where every Australian can realise their potential. I recall very fondly Professor Tom Calmer's 2005 Social Justice Report, which was the catalyst for the Close the Gap movement and the government's subsequent response, including the signing of that agreement in the Great Hall, where people didn't realise the full magnitude of what would evolve from those signatures. You will hear bells going at the moment they're the Senate. I welcome the 2021 Close the Gap campaign report. Leadership and legacy through crisis, keeping our mob safe. It certainly has been a year of crisis, but who could have ever predicted the outcome? It is one of the most impressive examples of success in the world. At the commencement of the outbreak, there was serious concern about the impact COVID-19 would have on our communities around this country. And everybody stepped up. ATSHOs, traditional owners, elders, young leaders in charge of Aboriginal organisations, and the community themselves. In fact, the APY lands were the first to indicate that they were closing their borders to protect their community and had established mechanisms to engage with the outside world. We have shown what we can achieve by working in partnership. As June Oscar says in the report, at the onset of COVID, Australian governments finally put their trust in us. It was the people on the ground, local insights and expertise that prevented a catastrophic disaster. It shows all of us the importance of local community voices in closing the gap. And then when local voices are heard by government, and I mean genuinely listened to, by working together, we can change lives. We can protect each other. I was also impressed by the voices of our young people echoing through the pages of this year's report. We rightly respect elders and their guidance of our people, but we also need to listen to them and learn from them as well, and encourage our young people to culturally engage, to take that knowledge and wisdom into their own sphere of understanding of the world around them, because if they don't, then we lose that long connection to the laws and traditions, the arts, the songs, the dances. They are the key to a successful future. I am continually impressed by the examples brought to our attention through this campaign. Your campaign motivates and demonstrates significant progress in closing the health and life expectancy gap between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and non-Indigenous Australians. The campaign is a great example of community-led action. It's not government leading, and that's been a great focus of mine and this government's. Great change comes when we can motivate enough people to care and enough people to make it happen. Governments can never force anyone. The more people we have who are leading in their own way, using their own voices, the more likely we will achieve our common goal to improve the lives of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, regardless of the geographic diversity of this country. I wholeheartedly agree with the steering committee in saying we need to break new ground for the systemic and transformational change, which is why last year the government made a significant shift in our approach to closing the gap. I note your report called the new agreement on closing the gap a potential game changer for shared decision making, and I agree. This is the first time governments have negotiated a national agreement in partnership with Indigenous Australians. It was developed between Australian governments, the Coalition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Peak organisations, and the Australian Local Government Association. The national agreement centres around 4 key priority reforms: shared decision-making, building the Indigenous community-controlled service sector, transforming mainstream services, and sharing data. The priority reforms are how we will deliver on the targets. The agreement requires all governments to change the way they work with Indigenous Australians. And I've already noticed some of the positive changes from my colleagues in governments, their departments and their agencies. My colleagues in Cabinet are all working with their departments to implement a new way of working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. For example, the work being done in education, skills and employment portfolio, initially under Minister Dan Tehan and now Minister Alan Tudge, is a good example of working in partnership across the whole portfolio, not just in Indigenous specific programs, to help our people into jobs through education, training and skills development. It is a quantum shift. Targets will help to monitor progress in life outcomes. Under each target, there are indicators that provide information about how we are tracking. For the first time, all parties share accountabilities for the target. We've not had that before. It's only been the Commonwealth that has been accountable. Every state and territory government will now have to report on the targets of the closing the gap within their state or territory parliaments, which means they will be open to scrutiny about what they have achieved, where the gaps are, and where they are required to do substantial work to move towards achieving the outcomes that we seek. This agreement has more accountabilities and obligations on all parties than ever before. Under the national agreement, all parties will develop implementation plans by July 21. The Commonwealth Government, each state and territory government, the Australian Local Government Association and the Coalition of Peaks. In the Morrison government, all ministers are responsible for the actions to achieve targets in their portfolios. It is no longer the single responsibility of the Minister for Indigenous Australians. It is now shared across portfolios. As for reporting, all that is changing is the timing of when we will deliver our assessment of our performance. Going forward, the Productivity Commission will deliver an independent Closing the Gap data report annually, and every 3 years, a review of progress nationally. The first annual data compilation report will be released by the Productivity Commission in July this year. The Productivity Commission is also developing a real-time public data dashboard, which will go live by the end of June 2021. In concluding, I want to say that our great country has shown how people can adapt and respond to crisis to make rapid and significant reform to the way things are done through strength-based, community-led actions, but equally community-led solutions. We need to get the same sense of urgency on closing the gap on the broad spectrum of socioeconomic issues. It takes more than just government to do it. We need everybody on board. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak today at the launch of the 2021 Close the Gap campaign report. And I look forward to hearing more of the work that you are doing to make a positive difference. And I want to thank you for your endeavours, your commitment and your passion for what you put towards compiling the reports, but identifying all those elements of strength. And what I want us to do is to focus on what have we achieved as opposed to what is the deficit. I'm tired of hearing our people referred to in the deficit mode. I want to hear that instead of the gap being 26%, I want to know that we have achieved 74% and that next year we're going to achieve closer to 80. So we become much more ambitious in the way in which we think. We have lived as Indigenous Australians on the messages of deficit and on the messages of disadvantage But I also want us to reflect and share where success happens and to demonstrate that we do achieve things very effectively and well. And when we do that, that'll encourage our children to know, and those who come after us, that we are good at what we do and that we are becoming better. And if I look at health in, for example, that is exemplified by Indigenous doctors and nurses, the number we have now compared to when we had our first doctor graduate and we thought that she would be the only one. But now I meet so many who are successful. So let's celebrate our successes, but keep reminding each other that much more has to be done in order to get the equity that we rightly deserve. Thank you and congratulations to you all.
Minister Wyatt, thanks so very much, and particularly adding to highlighting there around the deficit and disadvantage story that we so often hear, and not forgetting to celebrate the successes as they come along as well. I mean, you also point there to the structural change through the agreement and how so much more work is happening and needs to happen around that. That report, I'm sure that many are waiting eagerly to see what that contains in the middle of the year. And also, I want to point out that you're discussing the significant progress that you see in this report, and that point around the great example of community-driven change. So thank you so very much for highlighting those. I know it's very busy up in Parliament on a sitting day, so we do appreciate your time, and I know that you can't stick around because you've got a lot of other stuff to get to. So thank you so very much. We do appreciate you being a part of this launch today and the work that you're doing in Parliament and through the NAAA as well. And that was the Minister, the Honourable Ken Wyatt, AM MP. Next up, we've got a short video for you. Sir Michael Marmot is a global leader in health research and has conducted groundbreaking studies into heart disease and stroke in particular. And he's also an internationally respected epidemiologist. So Michael is chair of the World Health Organization's Commission on Social Determinants of Health. Here's a short message that he sent. This is Sir Michael Marmot.
It's a privilege to spend a few minutes with you today. The nature of lockdown and where we are, impossible to do it in person, but this is second best. When I chaired the Commission of the Pan American Health Organization on Equity and Health Inequality in the Americas, one of the striking findings was that in all the relevant countries, Indigenous populations had worse health than the non-Indigenous populations. And we drew attention to that and to the ongoing legacy of colonialism. We said that all the social determinants of health apply in trying to explain the difference between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations, the health differences. But in addition, there's something else going on, particularly in a country like Canada. It was explained to us, you're not going to understand this unless you understand relationship to the land, to culture, to dignity, empowerment, all crucial. And I think about my visits to Australia and my attempts to engage with the problems of ill health in the Indigenous communities of Australia. And everything that our commissioners explained to me for the Americas seems to apply to Australia, if not more so. Yes, the social determinants of health are absolutely vital, and they go through the life course, starting with outcomes of pregnancy, early child development, education, employment, money, having enough money to live on, communities, and of course, lifestyle, all crucial. But we're not going to solve the problem simply by looking at those things as if it was simple and failing to understand the importance of empowerment, of control, of destiny, of leading lives of dignity. We do need money to solve those problems, I just listed. But money without empowerment, money without the opportunity, the possibility of leading lives of dignity will get us nowhere. Let me just recount one experience I had the last time I was able to visit. I was taken to the shed in Western Sydney that was set up to prevent Aboriginal male suicide. And among the various people I spoke to was a human rights lawyer. And she explained to me that the default position of the care services in Australia was not when to remove children from their families, not whether, but when to remove children from their families. And the next evening, I was having dinner with some of the leaders of VACCHO, the Victorian Aboriginal community-controlled healthcare organisations. And I reflected on what I'd seen in Sydney and what I'd been told. And I said, my understanding is it costs about $100,000 to take a child into care. Surely for $100,000, it would be possible to work with families to deal with problems of drug and alcohol and domestic violence. And one of the Aboriginal leaders there said, we're doing it. We've taken on that responsibility. Every time I hear a story like that, I'm filled with hope. Every time I see an Aboriginal leader leading a community-controlled healthcare organisation, I'm filled with optimism. And when I see Aboriginal doctors and administrators and teachers, and reflect that when I was a student at the University of Sydney, and Charles Perkins was the first university graduate of Indigenous background, what a shame that should have been on all of us. But now, looking at university graduates in leadership positions from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, they've come to visit me in London. I've met them in Victoria, in Alice Springs, in Darwin, in Sydney. And I'm filled with hope. There is a long way to go. But with organizations empowered to make a difference, such as this one, there's every reason for evidence-based hope. I wish you well. Thank you.
And we send our thanks to Sir Michael Marmot for that message. Unfortunately, obviously couldn't travel to Australia because of the ongoing restrictions. But the points he made there about the sad state of Indigenous health globally goes to why it's so important to have this conversation and the community work that you've heard from both June and Ken and everyone getting involved in this process right along the way and highlighting land, culture, dignity, empowerment. We can't separate those out from all of the broader close the gap targets and initiatives either. This is about fundamentally reconnecting and respecting. But they're the hope, the optimism. I don't know about you, but that gave me some sense to smile that there are reasons. And even that note at the end about doctors and professors, Indigenous people leading companies in politics across the board, in media even, leading the charge, having these conversations. Our next guest is exactly that, one of these incredible young Australians who's respected as an emerging Indigenous leader. Dr. Janine Mohamed is a Ngarrindjeri Kaurna woman from South Australia, the CEO of the Lowitja Institute, where she's made an impressive contribution to health in her role in the short time that she's been there. Previous roles as Chief Executive of the Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nurses and Midwives, but more broadly than that, across a distinguished career to Aboriginal community-controlled health. Here's Dr. Janine Mohamed to give observations of the report from the Lowitja Institute, the leadership and legacy through crisis, keeping our mob safe. Yuma, Dr. Janine, over to you.
There we go. Thank you, Dan, and thank you for calling me young. I always love to be called that. And thank you to my colleagues for your opening remarks. I think you've said it well, Dan. Our speakers have already given us so much richness to think deeply about today and into the future. So I'd like to acknowledge them, and also all of our allies who are online today, our supporters, and of course, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander community members, brothers, sisters joining us. We have over 3,000 registrations today, and we feel very supported. And of course, this video will be shared after today's webinar. I also, of course, would like to acknowledge all of the land, seas and waterways and skies from where you're all joining us. I'm on Ngunnawal, Ngambri country here in Canberra. And of course, it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge our elders, past, present, and our future emerging generations. As you've heard, I'm an Urunggugana woman and the CEO of the Lowitja Institute, Australia's only national and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander community-controlled institute for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander health research. And we are so, so proud to have prepared the 2021 Close the Gap campaign report, of course, on behalf of the National Close the Gap Steering Committee. The report, as I hope you've read, is entitled Leadership and Legacy Through Crisis, Keeping Our Mob Safe. As you'll hear and read, it looks at the exceptional legacy and the leadership of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in the face of multiple crises. The global pandemic that has killed more than 2.6 million people and caused profound suffering and loss around our globe. The Black Lives Matter movement, which has put an absolute spotlight globally on the systemic racial injustices that we as Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people feel. And we've also seen the growing toll of the climate crisis, especially in Australia, where we are experiencing the ongoing aftermath and the devastation of the 2019-2020 bushfires. So we believe our report is a wake-up call to governments, and that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples have the solution to the health inequity gap that we experience, and it's well within our grasp if we were only allowed to lead. And there's no more, as you've already heard, a glowing example of our leadership than our COVID-19 rates, where we're 6 times less likely to be infected than other Australians. That's something that all of Australia should be proud of. And like the Lowitja Institute, the Close the Gap campaign takes a strengths-based approach to research, policy and practice. And believe me, this is not a denial or an oversight of the systemic racism, the short-term funding cycles, the poor infrastructure or any other barriers faced by us as communities. We reject absolutely the deficit-based policies and culturally unsafe systems that reduce Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people and communities to problems or statistics. I spoke earlier today about my journey in this world. It's always the narrative of the problem with Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples as opposed to the problems we face and the solutions and the resilience and the 60,000 plus years that we have cared for country. So we have the solutions to the big health challenges facing the world, whether that's inequality, pandemics, or the climate crisis. And our solutions are good for everyone, including non-Aboriginal people. So after a year like no other, the 2021 Close the Gap report showcases amazing success stories of the past year and many Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander organisations and their initiatives. And these include the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advisory Group on COVID-19. There are a number of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander community-controlled health organisations like the Kimberley Aboriginal Medical Service and the Central Australian Aboriginal Congress, who's there in Alice Springs, Wiminda and Kuntungal, who are on the New South Wales South Coast, as well as Vacho on NAM in Victoria, Seed Mob and the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation working to address the climate emergency and to protect our country. And in mental health, we have the extraordinary work of the Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing research project led by our very own Professor Pat Dudgeon, along with Gail Dewey project and the Alive and Kicking Goals Youth Suicide Prevention Program, also working in Broome. So the report shines a light on the policy environment that they and so many other Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples, communities and organisations work in, the enablers and the barriers to work to our work in closing this gap. It's a snapshot of excellence and a blueprint for the future, recognising that we have many crises still in our midst and many more that may emerge. The report shows the way forward with 15 very strong and clear recommendations for structural reform and strengths-based community-driven approaches, and they include, but are not limited to this list, the full implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, fully funding the Close the Gap National Agreement, and learning the lessons of the year regarding the success that happens when Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples lead the way, when we're in the driver's seat. And of course, one of the recommendations that's very close to my heart, raise the age of criminal responsibility nationally and immediately. I strongly believe, as many Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples do, that 10-year-olds should not be in detention. Most developed countries around the world have a minimum age of 14. Only Australia and England remain at 10-year-olds. The development and delivery of a national anti-racism strategy, and so much more that I hope you'll read. So my overall message to all Australians as we happily launch this report to you is that governments are not the solution. We are the solution to governments. I urge policymakers across the country to read this report and to hear our wake-up call. We will only ever travel at the speed of trust. And in concluding, I'd like to acknowledge and thank everyone who keeps the passion going to support the Close the Gap campaign and who continue to hold events every year in support of us. We are 3% of the population. We need our allies in the 97%, to drive this campaign forward. I look forward to hearing from everyone on the panel and your discussion. Thank you wholeheartedly for sharing your stories with the Lowitja Institute, and your work obviously is highlighted in the report. Thank you, everyone.
And Dr. Janine, I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you, and thank you for the passion that you bring to this role, the leadership and the way of bringing people together. You spoke of leadership there and of being put into the driver's seat, all of us being given that opportunity. Well, I think you epitomise that, quote, be the change you want to see in the world. And that point you make about this being a wake-up call to government, it's very clear, as going back to June earlier, that the solutions are here, the leadership is here. It's just up to the politicians, the policymakers, to open the pages and read and listen and learn and go from there. I also want to pick up on something you said about it all being within our grasp. If only we're given that chance to lead from a strength-based approach and not dismissing the very many deficits, the challenges that so many face on a daily basis, but saying that we're not going to just be led by that process. We're going to be led from the other side of that and have these big conversations. And I think you summed it up perfectly. It's a snapshot for excellence and a blueprint for the future, and perhaps even a roadmap of how to get into that future. So thank you so very much for all the work for this report and for the entire team that you've been leading in doing this. We're very, very grateful for your work. That was Dr. Janine Mohamed there, the boss, the CEO at the Lowitja Institute. And I would encourage you to read the report if you haven't had a chance yet. It is going to be online at the Lowitja Institute website, and you're going to be able to get those details. I'll give you to those a little bit later. We've got a panel discussion now to look at unpacking some of the detail, and we've only got a short time, so we're not going to get to it all, but this is just about having these conversations. And as Dr. Janine mentioned, they're about continuing the conversation. First up, we've got Angel Owen, a proud bachelor, Wapabara and South Sea Islander woman, driven by protecting country and culture for future generations. The mum of two says protecting country for her future generations, her children, their children and beyond, is crucial. She is the organising director at SEED, Australia's first Indigenous youth climate network, which you can see quite a bit of detail about them in the report. Yuma, good afternoon, Angel. Also, Professor James Ward is a Pitjantjatjara and Ngarrindjeri man, a national leader in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research. He has a long and distinguished career in public health and has been responsible for securing more than $23 million since 2013 for health research. He's the director of the Bourchier Centre for Indigenous Health at the University of Queensland. Welcome to you. Tom Bridson is a Kamilaroi and Gomeroi man, a respected leader in health, First Nations health and mental health. He's a member of a number of organisations driving change in health across the nation, and he's the CEO of the Gayadui Australia. Hello to you. And Kevin McKenzie is a Jabba Jabba Naranjin Bart Minang and Goreng man, an advocate for mental health awareness and an advocate for greater awareness and priority of helping to address mental health challenges and to having that greater understanding, particularly for First Nations people. Kevin, hello.
There you go.
Great to have you all along. I want to start first with Leadership and Legacy Through Crisis, the name of this report. After the 2020 that we've had, and the year that we've heard about First Nations mob around the country from Dr. Janine from June and the Minister, what's your view on where we're at right now? I want to start with you, Tom, on that one. Tom, if you can hear, you've just got your microphone switched to silent.
Yeah, not.
We've got you now, Tom.
Okay, great. Yeah, had a post on there. The host is not allowing me. So look, I think the legacy and particularly around areas of trauma and has never been clearer than in the last 12 months. The fallout from the bushfires, the fallout from the COVID, and the response that was just simply amazing in regards to the COVID pandemic that was impacting on communities and the actions that were taken. However, that still creates a whole lot of issues for people. And the other thing that sort of was really, really clear for me was that communities are left often to themselves, after things like fires and that type of thing. And the investment in the future should be into communities because we need to actually build communities as opposed to relying on the fly-in, fly-outs and all those elements that just didn't serve very well for us throughout crises and certainly responding to particular issues that are taking place for people.
Angel, what about for you? What's the last year been like?
Look, for me, the last year has been absolutely crazy. I welcomed the birth of my second child, as well as trying to navigate COVID and what that looks like with a baby already. I was living up in North Queensland and couldn't even buy formula for my son. So I was the landscape of the world has changed dramatically, and just trying to navigate that as a young mum, as well as working in the climate space, has just been, it's a lot, especially when we work with rural and remote frontline communities. It's been very hard to navigate.
We are going to unpack a little bit more detail about that space around climate and all of the issues that we've seen over the last year around that. Kevin, what about you, the last 12 months, leadership in crisis?
Yeah, it's been tough on my end as well. I'm in the same boat as Angel. My wife had our second baby as well last year. So just trying to navigate through all that has been pretty tough. Feedback from the community was, with all the other issues that we face, the COVID-19 and the Kimberley brought on feelings of being unsure and uncertainty, which added a lot more to what we're already facing, like with the issue of isolation. There's not much for the Kimberley people, even in remote communities. There's hardly anything out there for them to fall back on, and COVID just added to that. And there's a lot of fear issues around that as well. People were pretty scared and just wanted to get away, went out bush. adding to that isolation as well. So, going forward, it really shone a light on the gaps we already have, but it showed that our people were resilient and could adapt to the issues of COVID-19, and it shows that it's been passed down from our ancestors. So we can feel really proud of that as well.
James, what do you think when you hear that about the shining a spotlight on the challenges and in some instances even exacerbating those this last year?
Yeah, it's definitely been a challenging year, but I want to put it into perspective. There's no other country on the face of the planet that's done what Indigenous Australians have done. That is, protected our nation. We've had no community transmission in a remote community. We've had no single death among an Indigenous person from COVID. No other country on the planet has done it. And that has only been achieved with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership. A special call out to NAATSIHWP and to the member services across this country who have driven a response that has been exemplary, favoured by the overall Australian response. But I think what it has shown is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, when they're in the decision-making seat, when they're at the table, when they're in control, we can control our destiny. And I think it really, the COVID response really sets the foundation for us to move forward, particularly timely with the Close the Gap refresh. Our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander will be at the table. I'm very optimistic about our future now that we're at the table as we move forward with these ambitious set of targets.
And I guess to expand on the point that Kevin made there, last year, not only had COVID-19, there was a bushfire, smoke, a hailstorm here on Ngunnawal land. That was so long ago at the start of last year, it's almost easy to forget. But there was also the Black Lives Matter movement prompted by the killing of George Floyd. And it shone a powerful spotlight on issues here around over-incarceration, the health and education divide, interactions and issues with the judicial system. Just yesterday, we heard Senator Pat Dodson speak out about how when horrible things happen to Indigenous people, particularly Indigenous women, it doesn't cut through and doesn't prompt the outcry or the action that we have seen in other areas. Angel, I wonder if you have a sense of what needs to be done to shift this, to engage or to get the rest of the country interested in what's happening in our communities?
Look, I just think everyone's sort of shown the light on it a little bit. It just comes from leadership within our communities and actually providing the space for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from all over the country to have a voice and to be a part of the decision-making process, but to also, I guess, create space in things like mainstream media for us to tell our stories. Too often we're silenced and it's not fair. And I think, it's not really I don't really have a lot of knowledge in that area, but I definitely see a lot of gaps where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and leadership can fill. And, we have the knowledge and we have the skills and we just need a seat at the table, and it's long overdue.
James, what do you make of that?
Oh, look, I think these issues are slow burn issues, and I think we need to maintain the momentum. We need to maintain the pressure. It needs to be done at all different levels and all different angles in the country. A great majority of Australians are with us. It's really the people in the parliaments, in the corridors of parliaments. So really need to step up, listen to the voices of the majority of Australians that want change, and I think we will get there. But I think we need to maintain the pressure. Black Lives Matters in the middle of a pandemic, as someone that was really critical to the response in Australia, really frightened us. But it was really Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people exercising their sovereign rights to be able to protest against an intractable issue that has been going on forever and ever. And I really think we just need to maintain the pressure, maintain the momentum, support the other groups who are struggling for a voice right now, including women across this country, and then including our own, especially our own women.
Tom, off the back of that and looking at this through the prism of mental health, what sort of impact have you been seeing around as a result of the Black Lives Matter, but also COVID-19 and the impact that's having on mental health?
Look, I think there's enormous impact really in terms of, you know, individuals and families and communities. You know, the isolation that people feel through lockdown, the isolation that, you know, in terms of connecting with family, the isolation that tends to be applied because the only thing that we're looking at is the, you know, the square boxes and the social media space and those sorts of things. So the impact is very, very real. It's very present. And the messaging that's been pushed out there has been very sound in terms of trying to, you know, connect people to services, connect people to different other elements, and that type of thing. I guess the other part to many of or much of that is, you know, areas of obviously racism, the areas of rage, the areas. I mean, just recently there's been 3 deaths in custody as well. You know, at what point in time does this stop? You know, the Royal Commission was 1991, and we're still
30 years next month.
Yeah, still talking about these things that are basic, things like basic training for prison guards or basic training for police officers and that type of thing. Surely we've moved beyond that, but unfortunately we haven't. So I guess it's really about maintaining the rage, maintaining the you know, all the efforts that people are putting in, and one day people might move with us.
Kevin, do you want to add to that as well?
Yeah, I think it was just a hugely sad yet powerful issue that we all faced with the Black Lives Matter. It brings up a lot of underlying issues, I think, for our Indigenous people, going back to racism, how people were treated, and just the whole history of Indigenous people. I think a way forward maybe to focus a bit around the awareness and education of our history, you know, getting a full scope of where we've come from and how we can move forward.
Angel, the work that you have been doing with Seed Mob is featured in the report. For anyone who hasn't had a look through that or wants to hear from you, can you give us a sense of what you've been doing on climate change, what Seed Mob's all about, and why it's important now more than ever?
For sure. So Seed was launched back in 2014 as Australia's first Indigenous youth climate network, and we were really born out of the, I guess, the lack of representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the green environment space within Australia. And since our launch back in 2014, we've grown to a strong network of 300 volunteers in our grassroots movement and a small staff team. And we've created relationships both with our brothers and sisters here in Australia, but overseas as well. And our current campaign at the moment is to stand in solidarity and help support frontline communities in rural and remote Northern Territory to stop fracking on their country. And I think, you know, talking about leadership from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, what better way to support rural and remote communities and to help elevate their voice and let them have a say on what happens on their country, because we know at the end of the day, if our country is ill, then so are we. We're so connected to our country, and, you know, talking about recent bushfires, the impacts that could have or has had on mob not being able to connect back to country. And, you know, climate change is just an issue that really trickles down and affects a lot of other elements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's lives. And I just am so passionate about it. I'm lost for words at time, but, you know, just providing that platform and really supporting those frontline communities to have a say in what happens on their country and how that impacts their culture for future generations.
Yeah, we can hear the passion and we can see that in the report as well. And I guess, you know, to play devil's advocate a little bit, I wonder what all Australians can learn from the work that you're doing, from the experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, the solutions on the ground to these really vexing global challenges around climate change.
Yeah, I strongly believe that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have these solutions to climate change. We've been living sustainably off this land for tens of thousands of years, and we have what it takes to provide safe and healthy ecosystems and to nourish our land and give back and only take what we need. And I just, you know, again, it just is the issue that we just don't have a seat at the table, and we're not in the driver's seat at the moment. And there's people that are filling these leadership roles that shouldn't be speaking on behalf of our people. And it's time to move forward. Like, it's 2021. Let's get the right people in the decision-making like roles within Australia. And we have the knowledge. We just need someone to give us the space to really tell the story and to just, you know, it's in our dream time, it's in our songline. We have the answers. We just need space. And it's now. We need it now.
Yeah, it does feel like this is that moment of change, doesn't it? I wanted that ties in with what Dr. Janine said. It's within our grasp if only we were allowed to lead. And it's sort of like, people get out of the way and listen to the voices coming from a country. And look, because I just want to stick with this for half a second, I wonder if you get a sense that Australians more broadly are waking up to climate change and the effect of it right here in Australia, particularly as a result of what we saw, the bushfires, the smoke, the hail last year.
For sure. I definitely think like the conversation around climate change has become a lot easier to navigate and a lot easier to even talk about than it was in previous years. Like even trying to talk about it back when I was at high school was very hard, and the narrative has really shifted from this stereotypical polar ice caps and the polar bears and save the polar bears, you know, that stereotypical ideology of climate change, to it's actually a people problem. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia and our First Nations people around the world contribute least to climate change, but we are the first people globally to feel the impacts when it comes to the effect that it has on culture and country with severe weather events such as flooding and bushfires and things like that. You know, our culture is so entrenched and enriched with our country, and we know what it's like. If a certain tree doesn't blossom at a certain time, then that affects our songline and dream time to then tell us when a fish is running in the river. So we're so connected to country, and when it's changed and impacted by these severe weather events, it's detrimental to our culture.
I want to pick up on something Angel said there. James, how important is it to have Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in the driving seat, be it climate change that we've just heard about, or broader conversations around primary health care, community-controlled health, mental health?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, together, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander knowledges and Western science, I reckon, can inform climate change mitigation strategies and adaptation strategies. While I acknowledge that health and environment are two very different silos, that we can join up those silos, the better off we'll be in improving health outcomes, because climate change directly impacts health status, whether it be diet or habitat or regrowth, regeneration, sustainability. They directly impact health outcomes. And so they're two very different silos. The quicker we can join up those silos, the better off we'll be. One very big difference, I think, is that our government and the reason why we're in the situation we are with COVID right now in Australia is because government listened to science. We need to listen to the science, and we need to listen to Indigenous knowledges, also a science in its own right, about the way we move forward with climate change.
Tom, by extension of that, I guess, how do you embed that as a cultural change aspect of better empowering Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health outcomes, science outcomes and the like?
One of the things that Gayagiri Proud Spirit Australia has taken is its name from the Gayagiri Proud Spirit Declaration. And what that is a declaration, the international declaration around Indigenous mental health and suicide prevention and social and emotional wellbeing. And what the essence of that is the best of this and the best of that. So the best of cultural wellness and the best of clinical intervention, for example. So the best of both worlds is really about the approach that Gayagiri's talking about. Now, Gayagiri's made up of 7 board members from a collective group of people. So we've got Indigenous doctors, we've got the Indigenous psychologists, Indigenous Allied Health, the Leadership and Mental Health Group, NAATSIHWP on our board, as well as the Centre for Best Practice and the Postvention Service. And our chairperson is, in fact, the first doctor that was mentioned by Minister Wyatt earlier. But the essence of what we are about is the best of this and the best of that. So looking at the way in which we are doing things in terms of in communities in regards to social emotional well-being and mental health or suicide prevention, and really sort of bringing a collective voice to that discussion. Now, the difficulty with this whole space is that it's only been since really sort of 2017 where, it's been on that national agenda as a national priority, despite the enormous efforts for, 20 or 30 years or more in regards to people trying to get mental health and suicide prevention. And had we actually done what we should have done in the first place 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, we wouldn't be in this position. So this is where we're really trying to say, well, we're slow off the mark. We need to do some more work, and we need to do it in a real concerted effort that is long-term and sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, does it feel like there's a bit of a sense of a moment of change?
Yeah, I'd say so. I think everything's pointing towards us moving forward, and I agree with what Tom said. It needs to be a collective voice, and we need to drive it, and it needs to happen pretty quickly. Yeah.
And I think that perfectly heads us towards the end. I'm conscious we've gone over time, but I've got one more question that I think is pretty pertinent to where to from here. Angel, I want to start with you, and I'll open up to the whole panel, but we're having big conversations about climate change, about close the gap, about those targets, about how Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people are seen, respected, valued in Australia. What do you think are the next steps from here?
I think definitely self-determined communities, and allowing communities around the country have a say on what happens on their country and really take ownership. And it's just there. I do feel like there's a shift of change, and I feel like we're driving it as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders across the country. We really are. But yeah, I just am so strongly believe that communities should be able to have a say on what does and doesn't happen on their culture, on their country, because it affects their communities, and no one up the top can really have an opinion on what happens in a community better than people that live in that community, right? So yeah.
Kevin, what about you? Where to from here?
Yeah, I think a voice as well, but also a youth voice. Youth to discuss. Well, our youth are our future leaders, so if we can build their capacity now, they can carry on with what we're trying to do at the moment. So yeah, youth voice for me.
And Tom?
Look, I think there's many things that sort of, and this report sort of highlights a whole lot of them. And if they were enacted, if the national agreement was enacted, you would see reductions in and improvements in health right across the board. So I think, the whole space around optimism, momentum, sustainability are really, really key moving forward. And look at the fantastic leadership that's, sort of contributed to this whole space in terms of, not just looking at, what's happening in communities, but looking at, that whole sort of connection across all of that. And I think we're in a much better space, but we've got a huge journey in front of us.
And James, the final word to you, and where to from here?
Look, I think we need to be very careful about setting the right targets. I think we shouldn't limit ourselves to reaching equality with the non-Indigenous population, I think we should set our own targets and we shouldn't be afraid of that. The second thing I think we should do is think carefully about the interventions, the programs and policies that will get us to those targets. And particularly, I think the right potency, the right dose, the right time, the right population. I think we need to think very carefully about the interventions that will get us to reaching our targets. And finally, centering Indigenous people's knowledges and values and wisdom at the decision-making table will get us there. And finally, a very rigorous evaluation process as we go throughout this next phase of Close the Gap Refresh will get us there.
Yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive and thorough way of looking at it. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the panel. Angel Owen, organiser and director at SEED, Australia's first Indigenous Youth Climate Network. Wonderful to have you here. Professor James Ward, Director of the Monash Centre for Indigenous Health at the University of Queensland. Thank you. Tom Bridson, CEO of Gaia Dewey Australia. Wonderful to have you along. And Kevin McKenzie, a mental health advocate. Great to hear from you today. And so I do appreciate all of the insights for all of the panel and talking through a big range of issues and touching on quite a bit there. As I mentioned, we have slightly gone over a little bit to go. Today's webinar wouldn't be possible without the Australia Institute. The Australia Institute is hosting today's webinar in support of Close the Gap campaign, and they've generously partnered with the Close the Gap campaign, the steering committee, to get this webinar out there right across the nation and to ensure this whole conversation could be had with you wherever you are in our nation. The Australia Institute is one of the country's most influential public policy think tanks and conducts high impact research that combines rigorous fact-driven material with cutting-edge communication strategies driven by the goal to provide intellectual and policy leadership to conduct research that drives the public debate and secures policy outcomes that make Australia better. And there's plenty of webinars and other discussions and information on their website, australiainstitute.org.au, also on their social media and YouTube platforms. And this, in fact, this conversation will be up on YouTube and a link in the website as well. Ebony Bennett, the Deputy Director of the Australia Institute, and after working in federal politics for more than a decade, has seen quite a bit of those big conversations firsthand. Ms. Bennett has published research on climate change, gender, street harassment, and now hosts the Economics of a Pandemic webinar series and the Follow the Money podcast to give you a sense of why the Australia Institute was involved. Here's Ebony Bennett.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks to everyone on the panel. It's been such an amazing discussion today. Like Dan and Janine, I think I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country here at the Australia Institute office, and I just want to congratulate the Lowitja Institute on writing such a compelling report for Close the Gap. It's been absolutely terrific working with Close the Gap. A lot of the Australia Institute's research as a think tank focuses on reducing inequality. And I think the gap that remains between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, whether it's health, income, education, over-incarceration, it really is a continuing national travesty because it's a choice. Australia is one of the richest countries on earth, and we can afford to do basically anything we want, but not everything we want. And I think time and again, we've seen federal governments, happy to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on income tax cuts or submarines that we'll probably never use. But time and again, the tried and tested programs and organisations that are led by Aboriginal people really struggle to attract that secure long-term funding and support. And so it's been so encouraging to read about the new national agreement changing that dynamic. The report just makes so clear that when solutions are led by Aboriginal people, they work. I was actually on the board of AYCC when SEED first began, and it's so fantastic to see what Angel and the team at SEED are achieving when it comes to combating climate change. But in particular, the stunning success of the Aboriginal-led community-controlled health organisations that have really kept their communities safe and healthy during the pandemic when so many other First Nations communities have really been devastated around the world. It's just such a testament to the amazing work of those communities and the healthcare workers who serve them. So in a global crisis, it's just become so clear that Aboriginal people here and Torres Strait Islanders really stepped up And the response from the oldest continuing culture on earth was really world leading, better than even the Australian government managed to achieve. So when Close the Gap first approached the Australia Institute to host this webinar, we were so honoured and delighted. In the past year, obviously with the pandemic, we can't have in-person events anymore, but through our webinars, we have been in touch with tens of thousands of Australia Institute supporters who've attended our webinars, and we've really built a lovely community who's heard from Nobel Prize winners and Peace Prize winners, former presidents and prime ministers, artists, activists, academics, and some of our most popular webinars from last year were on treaty and sovereignty as part of the National Treaties Summit, and on the stunning success, as I said, of those Aboriginal-led health responses and the community-controlled organisations. And we spoke to a couple of frontline workers and health academics, and it was just so clear that people are really hungry for that kind of knowledge. And we're just so delighted to be able to share this platform and get the information that's coming out of the Close the Gap report today, and hear from all the panelists and share that with the thousands of people who've been coming to our webinars. We always try and make sure we're giving free access to the best thinkers and doers and the people who are really changing Australia for the better. And I can think of no more important cause for the Institute to help amplify and help more people to access than the Close the Gap campaign. We had more than 4,000 people register for today. They'll all end up getting this recording if they couldn't join us today. I think we've had more than 2,100 people on the line today. I want to thank everyone involved in Close the Gap, everyone who's been on this panel today, and thank everyone for tuning in today to hear this on behalf of the Australia Institute. Thank you to everyone, and thanks, Dan, for hosting.
Oh, my pleasure, and thanks for those kind words and for the way that you guys have brought this together and opened up this whole discussion to such a big audience right around the nation. I'm seeing the comments popping up of people mentioning the country that they're on, and it's wonderful to see that. I'm really, really thrilled. To round us out, we began by hearing from one of the co-chairs, June Oscar AO, and so we're coming full circle at the end of this discussion today. Karl Briscoe is a proud Kuku Yalanji man, has been an advocate in Indigenous health for many, many years. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the National Association of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Workers and Practitioners, the peak body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health workers and also practitioners. Karl Briscoe is also the co-chair of the Close the Gap campaign, and he's here to provide some closing remarks. You're welcome.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Yalada Yundu, Nyago Bobo Jalemba, Gubari, Yalanji Bama, Nyago Budi Jawalba. Hello, everyone. I'm a Gugi Yalanji man, as Dan said, from the Mossman Daintree area of far north Queensland. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional lands where everyone is zooming in from today. I'm on the land of the Ngunnawal people. I'd also like to recognise the beautiful landscapes that make up this country, and to my many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters that are online today. So we've just heard an overview of the 12th annual Close the Gap campaign report produced by the Lowitja Institute, which showcases the resilience, strengths and leadership of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, communities and organisations. I urge you all to have a read. More significantly, the report reinforces how effective and critical self-determination is in improving the health and well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It highlights that achieving positive lasting change requires a formula that is too simple to ignore. Value our culture, engage our leadership, share the power, and let us lead decisions about matters that affect us. Again, the report includes key recommendations for governments to act upon. Over the years, most of these have been discounted or quickly forgotten. Yet, this does not lessen our resolve or diminish our efforts. We remain steadfast and resolute in recommending the same approach. We know what works. We will not fail. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have the solutions to health inequality in their grasp. Governments must listen to us, involve us, invest in us, and change the way they work with us. Although the signing of the new national agreement on closing the gap is a positive development, it's congruent with Lowitja's report that draws attention to the needs for structural reform and to eliminate racism and embed cultural safety across our institutions. These actions must be prioritised. The harmful and enduring impacts of racism on our health and well-being should not be underestimated. We stand together and call for national action. We cannot wait any longer. It is time for many to take ownership for the role they play, the injury they cause, and the discord they perpetuate. Going forward, everybody must understand that equality and justice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will only be delivered when our governments choose to act in accordance with policies and principles and approaches they formally endorse. We will take responsibility for reiterating the same messages year after year. We are not responsible for the inaction or incongruence of our governments or our political class. In contrast, we stand proud of our actions, achievements, and the strength and resilience of our culture. This year's report demonstrates there is so much more to learn from our leadership. I would like to acknowledge our current and previous Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioners, Aunty June Oscar, Uncle Mick Gooder, and our first Commissioner, Uncle Tom Kalmer, for their leadership and contribution in improving the health and well-being for our people. Closing the gap is very much a people's movement, which occurs 365 days of the year. Finally, as a campaign co-chair, I do want to pay special acknowledgement to my other co-chair, Aunty June Oscar, and to our panellists, Angela Owen, Tom Brideson, and Professor James Ward and Kevin McKenzie. Also, the Lowitja Institute's chair, Aunty Pat Anderson, the CEO, Janine Mohamed, and her staff for producing this year's report and assisting in our comms. Our campaign Indigenous leadership group that we have, and the wider steering committee members, and the wider Australian public, including Ebony Bennett from the Australian Institute, and our members for their ongoing support and commitment to equality, justice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And of course to you, Dan Bourchier, for facilitating today's webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and such powerful words there. It struck me where you pointed out there about the positive lasting change, the formula for it actually being quite simple. Engage leadership, value culture, share power, and let us lead decision-making and discussions that affect us. It seems pretty straightforward, but it actually ends up being the toughest thing, isn't it, about getting all of those lined up. And I couldn't agree more that we can't wait any longer. And this report really puts truth to that, about explaining the circumstances, the situation right now. And as you've heard today from this incredible panel, where to from here, some of the ways to navigate the road ahead. So thank you for that, Karl Briscoe, co-chair of this group and of this process, along with Annie June, in getting everyone together and finding a way through, working, of course, with the Lowitja Institute to write this report. This recording will continue to live on the Australia Institute YouTube page and the Australia Institute website, so keep checking both, and I understand it'll also be sent out to the email address with which you signed up. For the Leadership and Legacy Through Crisis, Keeping Our Mob Safe report, visit the Lowitja Institute website at lowitja.org.au. Thank you so much for joining us and for staying for this conversation. It's been really wonderful to have you a part of this big discussion, looking to the past, but also thinking so much about the future. From me, Dan Bourchier, though, Yara, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.